Welcome. I'm Doug Morgan, and you're listening to Uncommon Sense, where we hunt for the truth in the topics you're not supposed to talk about, Christianity and politics. Can you believe that it was May 25th of 2020, yes, 5 years ago, that George Floyd died? And since then, of course, in the last 5 years, there has been a lot of contention. And in the last 5 years, there's been a lot of misinformation. And in the last 5 years, there's been a lot of information and facts that have come out. And so when I say that George Floyd was not killed by Derek Chauvin, I think a lot of people just kind of react to that, and many in a negative way. But as John Lloyd of the Spectator wrote last year, he wrote that to write that George Floyd died is to take a position. The received belief is that he was murdered, a murder bigger in its consequences than any other crime for decades. Unlike the relatively muted protests against Russian invasion of Ukraine, the streets of the world hosted men and women passionate in their denunciation of Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, whose detention in May 2020 of Floyd by apparently kneeling on his neck for around 10 minutes had killed him. Chauvin became a symbol for the perceived repressions of the state, any state, from South Africa to Germany, no matter how strongly committed to democratic governance and civil rights. In Melbourne, in April of 2021, while a jury debated Chauvin's guilt, a vigil was held, and in the UK, demonstrators cried, "Don't shoot, don't shoot," as Floyd had cried when first arrested. This, in the British case, to a wall of unarmed police. U.S. Embassies everywhere were surrounded. Black Lives Matter, founded after several shootings of African Americans at the hands of police officers in the early 2010s, took the lead in the vast responses of Floyd's death. The movement had a cause, a hero, and an emotional watchword. "I can't breathe," Floyd's last words as he lay on the street. Chauvin's kneel upon him, of course. So widespread was the belief that the police in the U.S. were semi-fascist and trigger-happy murder squads, at least as much as an article of faith among white liberals as among blacks, that the spark in Minneapolis became a blaze everywhere, quickly grasping that this was a cause liberals and leftists must astride. High officials and much of the media strove to identify with the protesters, even where the protesters turned, in some cases, to loot and arson, at first referred to as peaceful, of course. The Minneapolis mayor, Jacob Frey, in a tremendous and a trembling type voice, invoked the anguishing minutes of Floyd's death. Later in the memorial, he knelt before Floyd's coffin, weeping convulsively. Nancy Pelosi, the Democrats' leader in Congress, said at the impromptu press gathering that, quote, "We saw it happen," adding puzzledly, "Thank you, George Floyd, for sacrificing your life for justice." President Biden signed an executive order aimed at curbing police misconduct and said the Floyd's death sparked one of the largest civil rights movements in our nation's history and inspired the world. It also inspired two Black American academics, though not in the controversial way, the rapid elevation of George Floyd to martyrdom and the claim of broad unity in the face of white police brutality struck them. While Chauvin began a 22 and a half year sentence as worth examining more closely, unlike Pelosi, for whom seeing it happen was not to be questioned, they were and remain not sure of what happened. It is part of their self-appointed calling in their writing and social media presence to act as burrs under the saddle of demonstrative black victimhood. This rapidly became for them as much a mission to unpick the national and global outcries against Chauvin and the U.S. police as was BLM's drive to elevate the death to near Gethsemane status. Glenn Lowry is an economist professor at Brown University in Rhode Island and runs a Substack named The Glenn Show. John McWhorter teaches linguistics in New York Columbia University and was he has a column in the New York Times. Friends for decades, formerly moderately leftists, moderately concerned about white racism, their views evolved into a strong dislike of the influential view that whites are structurally racists, or as Jelani Cobb, the dean of Columbia Journalism School, has written in a New Yorker piece about Derek Bell, that racism is so deeply rooted in the makeup of American society that it has been able to reassert itself after each successive wave of reform aimed at eliminating it. It's not clear why the two varied so widely. But since the Floyd trial, the two men have developed the view that the affair has been drowned in a series of performative effusions, a cavalier approach to the case by the Minneapolis justice system, and by what Lowry calls the mob, which became the arbiters of what constitutes justice. McWhorter believes that we have been lied to by high officials and the media, so that any attempt to view the events of the 25th of May of 2020 on a Minneapolis street in other than the prism of bloodthirsty police gang is shouted down as racism. And in an exchange with Lowry, he says flatly that Derek Chauvin did not murder George Floyd. Their belief in in what has become the official version of Floyd's arrest and death is much strengthened by a film. It's called The Fall of Minneapolis, and it's written and directed by the writer J.C. Chaix, Chaix, by the way, and produced and reported by investigative reporter Liz Colin. Now, in close on 2 hours of documentary with multiple interviews, clips from the body cameras of the arresting officers, and excerpts from documents, the film underscores that the judge, Peter Cahill, refused to delay or move the trial to avoid influence on the jury by the huge coverage of the case, banned some evidence from an earlier arrest of Floyd, and would not allow evidence that Floyd had called out to his mother, who had died years earlier, a possible indication of confusion caused by an intake of drugs. The first autopsy on Floyd by Hennepin County medical examiner Andrew Baker, argued that the ingestion of fentanyl and a heart condition were contributory elements to Floyd's death. Together with the pressure on his neck, a further autopsy was commissioned by the family of George Floyd, which found that the death had been due to asphyxiation caused by primarily by the pressure on the neck. It's not clear why the two autopsies varied so widely, though. And the police body cameras appear to show that Floyd, who had a series of previous convictions and had been arrested for allegedly passing counterfeit money in a store near where he was detained, was wildly intoxicated, refused to obey police instructions, and had shouted several times, "I can't breathe," when standing up, or resisting efforts to put him in the back of the police car. The signature phrase is thus reduced from a dying cry to a possible outcome of drug use. The police called for an ambulance for Floyd shortly after his arrest, but due to confused messages, it did not appear, though stationed a few blocks away, for nearly 10 minutes, by which time Floyd may have been dying. The footage shows two policemen trying to revive him in the ambulance. Minneapolis police chief said on oath in court that his department he gave no training on holding a suspect down with the knee after they had been restrained. Yet the then current training manual in section 5-316 appears to show, alongside an accompanying training slide used in Minneapolis, just such a procedure. Not one widely used by other police departments, and now dropped by Minnesota police, of course. But the clip of Chauvin holding down Floyd, literally the killer fact with millions of views, closely resembles these directions. And the clip seems to show that Chauvin's leg was holding down Floyd's shoulder, with the knee either on or slightly above the neck. Well, taken together with the autopsy report that the neck showed no damage, it renders the judgment of murder by asphyxiation less certain than the version promoted by the prosecution and accepted by the jury. The trial took place in a hyper tense atmosphere. A crowd of thousands stood outside the court throughout the trial. Congresswoman Maxine Waters, among the protesters, told journalists that if a guilty verdict were not returned, quote, "we've got to stay on the streets and get more confrontational," unquote. In a series of interviews with policemen and women, all of whom had resigned after the trial, the Fall of Minneapolis film dwelt on the revision officers felt for the verdict and more, for what they saw as their desertion of the mayor and the Minnesota governor, Tim Walz. You remember him? Who had he had been referring to the clip of Chauvin with his knee on Floyd, that the lack of humanity in this disturbing video is sickening, and the police chief is too. Well, the film also had dramatic footage of a prolonged attack by protesters on Precinct 3, in which the four officers attending the Chauvin arrest were based, and from which all officers had been ordered to leave, abandoning the station to the fury and the wreckage of the protesters. An interview with Chauvin's mother elicited the comment that, quote, "I no longer believe in justice here," unquote, repeated by several of the police interviewed, including the two black officers, by the way. Yet, as Lowry admitted in an interview, doubts remain on his and McWhorter's side, deepened by a message to Lowry from Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison, who underlined the testimony of a witness, Dr. Martin Tobin, a respiratory specialist. Tobin had testified that Floyd did die from asphyxiation, even if it did not show in the initial autopsy. Lowry got the filmmaker makers on the Glenn show and asked them to defend their belief in the radical unfairness of the court case. Well, Shanks, the main speaker, said that Tobin was in the realm of conjecture, since it was Baker who had performed the initial autopsy. Lowry told me his doubts still remain, though he wrote on his Substack after a talk with the filmmakers containing no softballs that, in my opinion, the story holds up. What are we left with then is a judgment substantially crafted by prior elite approval of guilt and hustled by a militant crowd daring the outcome to be other than an exemplary sentence for murder. Enough, one would think, for an appeal in less, fervid times. Well, Mark Werder and Lowry, pitted against the victimhood narrative, have for years sought to polarize a Black American cast of mind, still experiencing a residue, and in places where the more a residue of racism, as still one of opportunity and a source of pride. This is my country, Lowry said. The two scholars believe that Black Americans should accept this, that racism is now residual rather than structural, that the way to self and communal material betterment is now largely the responsibility of the individual, and that the Black American communities should support such a view as one more likely to improve the lives of all American people of color and of American whites too. This would entail seeing whites as differing individuals rather than as taught in some versions of critical race theory, an indifferentiated mass of actual or potential racists. So the Floyd affair, however, remains stuck presently in what seems like a worldwide belief in unchanging Black American victimhood. Yet there's some hope that the two professors' activism may shift that to one which relies on facts and even fact-based faith in American policing and the civil society, not on belief of immovable prejudice. But Derek Chauvin, meanwhile, is recovering from serious injuries after he was stabbed in prison by a fellow inmate. And so you see, as he points out here, that there is a lot of people who just think that all white people are racist. And so this was a shining example of that this white officer, even though they ignore lots of other facts, they ignore the fact that the other officers were not white. They think, well, this is a shining example of how this white officer killed this Black man for almost nothing. And it's because of racism. They ignore the fact that the other officers were not white. They ignore the fact that there was fentanyl involved. In fact, Jaden Gelso of the Daily Wire writes, dozens of residents filled Chicago's Federal Plaza on May 25th to commemorate the 5th anniversary of George Floyd's controversial death that led to riots across the world. TPUSA contributor Savannah Hernandez was right there to greet them, asking protesters what they thought of Floyd's autopsy results that showed that he died of a fentanyl overdose. She was met with confusion, with pushback, and even hostility. Quote, bringing up the fentanyl thing is effed up, one protester spat. Let's just pretend that it was from the drug, right? Who cares? That's not how he effing died, unquote. Many of the protesters Hernandez spoke to echoed the who cares sentiment. Quote, the autopsy report that says there was fentanyl in his system, why is that relevant to anything? One protester asked. Maybe he did have fentanyl in his system. I don't care. It doesn't matter. Other residents denied the evidence of fentanyl overdose altogether. I think it's untrue and propaganda that he died from a fentanyl overdose, one protester said, despite seeing the autopsy report. Quote, America is still racist, one man claimed from behind a mask, a sentence a stance that some white protesters agreed with, seeking to acknowledge their supported privilege, of course. It's so important for white people to not forget George Floyd, one said. I am a white woman and I have privilege, so I want to be able to show up in these spaces and make sure that other communities are safe, said another. Hernandez passed one protester that said, do you feel like if George Floyd was white, the narrative surrounding the death would be different, she asked. And the woman just said, absolutely. Everyone would know. Well, on May 25th of 2020, a store owner in Minneapolis called the police on Floyd over a counterfeit bill, of course. And once law enforcement arrived, a struggle ensued near the police vehicle, leading Officer Derek Chauvin to kneel on Floyd's upper back while he was handcuffed and lying face down, and Floyd died during the restraint, leading to widespread outrage, of course, riots against police brutality and all that kind of stuff. And Chauvin was convicted of murder and sentenced to 22 and a half years in prison. However, the autopsy report revealed Floyd died from fentanyl overdose, and that he took before the police arrived, meaning Chauvin's restraint did not suffocate him. And of course, the Daily Wire has pushed for a pardon of Chauvin. In fact, Ben Shapiro there has a series of videos that you can pull up and you can watch on the case for Derek Chauvin. Ryan King of the New York Post said that conservative pundit Ben Shapiro announced that he wants President Trump to pardon former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin of all federal crimes in the May 2020 death of George Floyd. The Ben Shapiro Show host has launched a petition backing a public letter to Trump contending that Chauvin, now 48, was unjustly convicted of Floyd's killing, which led to riots in cities across the U.S. and a national reckoning on the issues of race and policing. A local jury in Minneapolis found Chauvin guilty of unintentional second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter in April of 2021, and later sentenced him to 22 and a half years in prison. The following year, Chauvin was sentenced to 21 years in prison after pleading guilty to 2 violations of federal civil rights law, one in connection with Floyd's death and one related to Chauvin's 2017 arrest of a 14-year-old. A pardon by Trump would only erase the federal charges against Chauvin, who is currently behind bars at a low-security facility in Texas. Quote, there was massive, overt pressure on the Minnesota jury to return a guilty verdict regardless of the evidence or any semblance of impartial deliberation, Shapiro wrote in the letter. This pressure took the form of threats, coercion, and intimidation. This is what he concluded, faulting politicians for publicly prejudging the case. Quote, there was no opportunity for blind justice to work, and a man is now rotting in prison because of it. Make no mistake, he said, the Derek Chauvin conviction represents the defining achievement of the woke movement in American politics. And of course, this is the fifth anniversary of his death, after he tried to use a counterfeit $20 bill, and of course the ensuing struggle that led to his death. And during the encounter, Floyd was repeatedly, of course, saying that he couldn't breathe, but he was saying that even before he was on the ground. He was saying that when the officers first showed up, and here's a quote. It says, George Floyd was high on fentanyl. He had a significant pre-existing heart condition. This is what Shapiro said on his radio show. He said, George Floyd was saying he could not breathe before he was even out of the car. He was in the car saying that he could not breathe. Derek Chauvin, for large segments of even the tape that was shown, had his knee on George Floyd's shoulder or back, not his neck. The autopsy of George Floyd showed that he had no damage to his trachea, that probably George Floyd died of existing delirium. The conservative pundit also underscored that there was no accusations in the Minnesota trial that Chauvin had committed a hate crime against George Floyd, or that he targeted George Floyd because of his race. He said, quote, I think it is worth while to remember that there is a man who's rotting in prison because the media decided in the middle of 2020 that they were going to turn a tragic law enforcement stop into the raison d'etre of the entire 2020 election. Special White House employee, of course, Elon Musk, later chimed in on Musk's petition, writing on X that something to think about after that was done. And of course, Trump has wielded his power pretty aggressively during the second term, granting clemency to thousands of the January 6th Capitol riot. So it is potentially something that could happen. But I wanted to also bring you this article from Michael Levin from The Hill, and it kind of gives the other side a little bit, and talks about Ben Shapiro's deal. He goes into a little bit about what Ben Shapiro was saying, and Elon Musk was supporting, of course. And he says that there. He tries to come against the arguments. He says Shapiro makes three arguments for the pardon. The first is that Chauvin was not the approximate cause of Floyd's death. Floyd, Shapiro argues, died of an unrelated heart ailment. He says, excuse me, if someone's kneeling on my neck for 10 minutes, I'm going to die of something. Well, again, he wasn't on his neck. There was no damage to the trachea. I mean, you can't say that. This is just emotionalism here. But he goes on and he says, second, Shapiro says society was convulsed by the riots that followed. The rioting and looting after Lloyd's murder is indeed indefensible. People smash windows and grab Uggs. Grabbing Uggs cannot be regarded as a proper civil protest. But Chauvin had nothing to do with the protests. He committed a crime, and thank God he's doing the time. He doesn't get a pass for what he did just because society went nuts afterwards. So again, he's saying that you can't connect the two. And you can connect the two. The riots happened because people were stirred up and even paid in some cases to do these protests. And they used it as an excuse to go on a riot spree. And he says, finally, Shapiro argues the jury was under intense pressure to return a guilty verdict for Chauvin, so the conviction should be overturned. He says, first, the jury was sequestered, so how would it have known about societal pressures to convict? Second, if that's Chauvin's argument, he should make it on appeal. Third, the argument was rejected by an appellate court. Game over. Okay. To say that the jury knew nothing about the case going into it because they were sequestered during the trial a year later is just absolutely asinine. But this is what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about here is that the case against Derek Chauvin is purely emotional. The fact that people say that this guy was killed, that George Floyd was killed, is just emotional. It's emotionalism. It's not rooted in fact. You can't say that he suffocated because the guy had his knee on his neck, because the facts say that's not true. And so what the facts show is that he died of fentanyl and a prior heart ailment. That's, and sure, brought on by the excitement of what was happening, of course. But what was happening was because of him and what he did prior to that. And so to make him a martyr and to say that he was murdered is just simply not correct. And I would love to hear what you think of it. This fifth anniversary of what happened there. Of course, you can always do that at uncommonsensepodcast.com. Of course, we're on YouTube now, and you can would definitely love to have you subscribe there, to hit the like button, share, all that kind of stuff. And thank you for listening.
This podcast is a production of Morganite Communications.